The honeymoon took them, at Ravel's quiet insistence, somewhere entirely removed from underworld politics and sacred gear surveillance, both, a small coastal town on the human side of the world that Issei's mother had recommended years earlier and never quite gotten around to visiting herself. No wards, Ravel said, standing on the balcony of their rented cottage that first evening, watching the sun sink slow and orange over open water. No security rotations. No one here has any idea who either of us actually is. She exhaled, something in her posture unwinding in a way Issei had rarely seen from her, even in their quietest moments together. I find I have missed the particular freedom of being simply ordinary. You're not exactly built for ordinary, Issei said, joining her at the railing, but I get what you mean. They spent the week doing nothing of any real consequence. Long walks along the shoreline, mediocre attempts at cooking in the cottage's small kitchen that ended, more often than not, in shared laughter over some minor culinary disaster, quiet mornings that stretched lazily into afternoon with no agenda beyond simply being together without interruption. It was, Issei thought, the first genuinely unhurried stretch of time either of them had shared since the rail yard mission over a year earlier, and he found himself surprised by how quickly his usual restless energy settled into something calmer, steadier, in the absence of any looming crisis demanding his attention. I keep waiting for something to go wrong, he admitted one evening, the two of them sitting together on the cottage's small porch, watching the stars emerge over the water. Feels strange, having an entire week where nothing did. That is, I think, rather the point of a honeymoon, Ravel said dryly, though she leaned into him as she said it, no real reproach in her tone. You are allowed to simply enjoy something without waiting for the difficulty that usually follows. We have earned, I believe, at least this much uncomplicated happiness. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close against the cooling evening air, and for a long while either of them spoke at all, content simply to watch the stars and listen to the distant, steady rhythm of waves against the shore, the world's usual demands held, for one precious week, entirely at bay. The second celebration, the considerably smaller one arranged for Issei's human relatives, took place the weekend after they returned from the coast, in the modest backyard of the Hyoudou house strung with paper lanterns his mother had spent an entire week agonizing over. Ravel, who had approached the underworld wedding with practiced, composed grace, admitted afterward that this smaller gathering had made her considerably more nervous. Your mother has been planning this since long before she knew I existed, she said, smoothing the simpler, considerably less formal dress she had chosen for the occasion. I find that a peculiar kind of pressure. I do not wish to disappoint a version of this celebration she has apparently imagined since you were 12. You could show up in gym clothes and she'd still cry happy tears, Issei said, only half joking. Trust me. You don't have anything to worry about. He was, as it turned out, entirely correct. His mother burst into tears the moment Ravel walked through the garden gate. His father managed a wobbling, emotional toast that trailed off twice before he recovered enough composure to finish it, and Ravel, watching the unpolished, entirely unchoreographed warmth of it all unfold around her, found herself laughing more freely than she had at the far grander underworld ceremony weeks earlier. This is considerably less formal than I expected, she murmured to Issei, watching his uncle attempt, with mixed success, to operate an old karaoke machine someone had dragged out from the garage. Yeah, Issei said, grinning. That's kind of the point. Later, once the small gathering had settled into easy, comfortable conversation over homemade food that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the elaborate underworld reception spread, Issei's mother pulled Ravel aside with the particular determined warmth of someone who had clearly been waiting all evening for exactly this moment. I know it's a lot, she said, taking Ravel's hands in her own. All of it. The underworld side of things, I mean. I don't pretend to understand half of what my son gets up to most days. She smiled, something genuine and unguarded in it. But I know my son, and I have never seen him as steady, as sure of himself, as he's been since you came into his life. Whatever world you both actually belong to, I'm just glad he found someone who sees him properly. That's all any mother really wants. Ravel, uncharacteristically caught off guard, found her composure genuinely tested for the first time all evening. Thank you, she said finally, voice a little unsteady. That means more to me than you likely realize. They stayed late into the evening, long after most of the relatives had drifted home, Issei's parents insisting on cleaning up themselves while shooing the newlyweds toward the porch to simply sit and enjoy the quiet, lantern-lit yard a while longer. 2 weddings in 1 month, Ravel said, leaning against him on the porch steps, the paper lanterns swaying gently overhead. I am not certain any bride in either the human world or the underworld has managed quite this particular combination before. We do things our own way, Issei said, and found, watching her smile in the soft lantern light, that he had never meant anything more completely in his entire life. Married life, once the immediate whirlwind of 2 separate wedding celebrations finally settled, brought its own quiet, unglamorous adjustments that neither of them had fully anticipated amid the earlier drama of engagement, duels, and eventual ceremony. There was, for one thing, the ongoing negotiation of shared space, Ravel's meticulous organizational habits colliding, gently but persistently, with Issei's considerably more relaxed approach to domestic order. Your training equipment cannot simply remain scattered across the living room floor indefinitely, Ravel informed him, not for the first time, surveying the modest apartment's main room with the particular exasperated affection that had become, over the preceding weeks, an entirely familiar rhythm between them. We agreed on designated storage for exactly this reason. I was going to put it away, Issei protested, already moving to do exactly that under her pointed stare. You say that every morning. And I mean it every morning. She rolled her eyes, though the smile tugging at her mouth undercut whatever remaining irritation she might have genuinely felt, and within the hour the equipment had, indeed, found its way into proper storage, the small domestic dispute resolved with the same easy, comfortable familiarity that had come to define most of their shared life together. Beyond the small daily negotiations, there remained the more significant business of settling into their evolving roles within the broader peerage. Ravel's tactical acumen increasingly sought not only by the Gremory group but by Sona's team as well, occasional consulting requests arriving that spoke to a growing reputation entirely separate from her connection to Issei. Sona wants my opinion on a defensive restructuring for her own peerage's formation, Ravel said one evening, reviewing a formal request with visible, quiet pride. That is, I believe, the first time anyone has sought my tactical input purely on its own merits, rather than as an extension of my relationship to you or my family's standing. You've earned that, Issei said, and meant it entirely. You'd have earned it a lot sooner if people had actually been paying attention. Ravel considered this for a moment, something thoughtful crossing her expression. I find I do not mind that it took this particular path to arrive here, she said finally. The version of myself who might have received that same recognition purely through my family's standing, without ever having to prove it through genuine, difficult work, would not have valued it nearly as much as I do now. It was, Issei thought, exactly the kind of hard-won perspective that had defined so much of their shared journey together, difficulty transformed, gradually and deliberately, into something considerably more valuable than the easier path either of them might once have preferred. Returning to Co meant returning, inevitably, to the practical business of building a shared life within the framework of the peerage, and the adjustment, though welcome, brought its own quiet complications neither of them had fully anticipated. We cannot simply continue splitting time between your family's house and my old rooms at the liaison office, Ravel said, reviewing a stack of property listings with her usual meticulous focus, spread across the kitchen table of what had, until recently, been exclusively Issei's childhood bedroom. It is impractical, and frankly your mother deserves her space back now that her son is a married man. Issei's mother, for her part, had greeted the prospect of her son moving into his own place with a mixture of genuine excitement and only mildly exaggerated tears, already fully invested in helping select furniture despite having no clear understanding of exactly how much of the apartment's actual funding came from underworld sources rather than any conventional human income. They settled, eventually, on a modest apartment close enough to both Co Academy and the old Hyoudou house to remain convenient, and the process of actually building a shared domestic life together, learning each other's small daily habits and preferences outside the heightened context of training and crisis, proved unexpectedly grounding. You genuinely eat that combination for breakfast, Ravel said, watching with open disbelief one morning as Issei assembled something that could most charitably be described as an experimental sandwich. Every single day. Without variation. It works, Issei said, unbothered by her judgment. Don't fix what isn't broken. I am fairly confident several things about that sandwich are, in fact, broken, Ravel said, though there was no real heat in it, only the particular fond exasperation of someone settling comfortably into the small, mundane textures of shared life. I am adding proper breakfast preparation to our household rotation, starting immediately. The peerage's own rhythms shifted subtly too, in the wake of the wedding, a new maturity settling across the group that reflected, Issei thought, watching Rias direct a training session with the same steady authority she had spent over a year rebuilding, exactly how far all of them had traveled since the fractured weeks following the rail yard mission. Kiba had taken to mentoring newer devils in the broader code territory, his own earlier insecurities about Issei's rapid growth apparently resolved into something more settled and generous. Kaneko, though still characteristically quiet, had grown noticeably more open in small, unmistakable ways, occasionally initiating conversation rather than simply responding when spoken to. Even Gasper, once so thoroughly folded into the corner of every room, had begun, tentatively, to take on more active roles during missions, his confidence steadily building alongside the rest of the teams. It was, Issei reflected, exactly the kind of peerage he had once feared. In his darkest weeks of isolation, he might never truly belong to again. The trial of the captured Ouroboros figure took place under strict underworld judicial oversight 3 weeks after the wedding, and Issei, called to testify alongside the rest of those who had participated in his capture, found the proceedings considerably more unsettling than he had anticipated. He is not talking, the presiding official informed the assembled witnesses afterward, frustration evident despite the formal proceedings' careful neutrality. Whatever information he might possess about Ouroboros' broader leadership structure, he has proven entirely unwilling to divulge it, even under the judicial compulsion typically effective against lesser operatives. That suggests he's protecting someone, Rias observed, exchanging a grim look with Azazel, who had attended the proceedings with visible, uncharacteristic tension. Or someone considerably more dangerous than him. Azazel's expression remained troubled in the days that followed, and it was nearly a week later, during a private briefing at the Gremory clubroom, that he finally shared what his own continued investigation had uncovered. I don't think he was ever the true head of Ouroboros, Azazel said, spreading a fresh set of intelligence reports across the desk, his usual dry humor entirely absent. I think he was, at most, a senior operational commander, extremely dangerous in his own right, but answering to someone higher still. Someone who has remained, throughout this entire conflict, carefully hidden behind layers of compartmentalized operations specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of exposure. Do we have any leads on who that might be? Ravel asked, her earlier organizational instincts sharpening immediately at the prospect of a genuinely unresolved threat. A few fragments, nothing concrete yet. Azazel's expression darkened further. But the resources required to fund an operation of Ouroboros' scale, the specialized alchemical research, the coordinated cell structure across multiple territories, that level of investment doesn't come from a mid-tier operative working independently. Whoever is truly behind this has resources and patience that suggest considerably higher standing within the broader Chaos Brigade remnant network, or possibly connections beyond it entirely. The news settled uneasily across the room, the hard-won piece of the preceding weeks suddenly feeling considerably more provisional than any of them had allowed themselves to believe. So this isn't actually over, Issei said slowly, old vigilance already beginning to reassert itself despite months of hard-earned calm. No, Azazel confirmed, grim but honest. I don't think it is. I think we bought ourselves time, real, valuable time, by dismantling the operational structure you all fought so hard against. But the true architect behind Ouroboros remains out there, presumably reassessing their approach after losing both a facility and a senior commander to your combined efforts. I would not expect them to move again quickly. But I would be lying if I told you this threat was fully resolved. Ravel's hand found Issei's beneath the table, steady and certain despite the unwelcome news. Then we continue preparing, she said, resolve settling firm into her voice. We have faced patient, hidden threats before. We will face this one the same way, together, whenever it finally chooses to reveal itself. Azazel returned 3 days later with a request neither Issei nor Ravel had anticipated, a formal invitation, extended through underworld judicial channels, for Ravel specifically to sit in on a supervised interrogation session with the captured Ouroboros commander, her first-hand experience, as one of his intended targets deemed potentially valuable to breaking through his continued silence. You do not have to agree to this, Rias said carefully, when the request was first raised. No one would think less of you for declining. I want to do it, Ravel said, after a moment's consideration, something steady and deliberate in her expression. I have spent this past year being hunted, targeted, treated as a data point in someone else's calculated experiment. I find I would rather look the man who orchestrated that directly in the eye than continue avoiding him from a comfortable distance. The interrogation chamber, when Ravel finally entered it 2 days later with Issei insisting, despite formal protocol reluctance, on accompanying her as far as observation would permit, carried a cold, clinical hush entirely unlike the chaos of their earlier confrontations. The commander sat restrained at a bare metal table, considerably diminished from the composed, calculating figure who had once addressed them in Vane's warehouse, but his eyes sharpened with unmistakable recognition the moment Ravel entered. Lady Phoenix, he said, voice rough from disuse but still carrying traces of his earlier cold precision. Or Lady Hyoudou now, I understand. My congratulations on the marriage. I do hope the wedding day incident did not spoil the celebration too thoroughly. You do not get to make pleasant conversation with me, Ravel said, voice steady despite the deliberate provocation. I am here because I want you to understand something plainly. You spent months treating me as an asset to be acquired, a data point in whatever calculation your organization was running. I want you to know that I am not that. I never was. And whatever remains of your organization's ambitions, I intend to make certain they end here, with you, rather than continuing to threaten anyone else the way you threatened me. Something flickered behind the commander's carefully guarded expression, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, studying her with an intensity that made Issei, watching from behind the observation glass, tense with old protective instinct. You are, I confess, more formidable than the reports suggested, the commander said finally, something almost like grudging respect entering his voice. I do not believe I will be providing the information your investigators want. My discretion is the only thing standing between my remaining family and considerable retribution from those I answer to. But I will tell you this much, freely, because I find I have grown tired of watching an organization I once believed served a genuine purpose reduce itself to hunting frightened young women for their bloodline potential. He met Ravel's eyes steadily. The man you are looking for values control above all else. He will not simply retreat quietly after this. Watch your tournament season closely, Lady Hyoudou. I suspect he has not yet finished testing you. It was not the confession Azazel had hoped for, but it was, Ravel reflected afterward, walking out of the chamber with Issei's steady presence beside her, considerably more than nothing, a warning that would prove, in the weeks that followed, entirely, unnervingly accurate. You did well in there, Issei said, once they had cleared the judicial facility's outer corridors and stepped back into the ordinary evening air. I know that wasn't easy. No, Ravel admitted, some of the composure she had maintained throughout the interrogation finally easing now that the formal proceedings were behind her. It was considerably harder than I let myself show in there. Looking at the person who orchestrated an attempt to have me forcibly removed from my own life, and finding, despite everything, some small part of myself almost feeling sorry for how thoroughly his own organization had used him. She shook her head, as though trying to dislodge the thought. That is, I think, not a particularly comfortable thing to admit. It doesn't make you weak, wanting to understand him a little, Issei said gently. It just means you're still you. Still someone who sees people clearly, even people who tried to hurt you. Ravel considered this for a long moment before allowing herself a small, tired smile. That is a rather generous interpretation, she said. But I will accept it, coming from you. She took his hand as they walked, the evening settling comfortably around them. For what it is worth, I meant what I told him. Whatever remains of that organization, whoever truly sits above him in its hierarchy, I do not intend to let them threaten anyone else the way they threatened me. Not while I have breath left to prevent it. I know, Issei said. That's kind of why I married you. Among other reasons. Ravel laughed, some of the day's heaviness finally lifting. A romantic sentiment, delivered immediately after a formal underworld interrogation, she said. Only you, Issei Hyoudou. Hey, you love it? I do, she admitted, squeezing his hand as they continued on toward home, the last of the day's tension finally easing into something calmer, steadier. The promise of whatever difficulties still lay ahead met, as always now, with the quiet certainty that they would face it together. The quarter-final match, sandwiched between the tournament's increasingly demanding rounds, brought the Gremory peerage against a peerage built around unpredictable illusion magic, a considerably different tactical challenge than the raw physical power or disciplined coordination they had faced in earlier rounds. This one will test our communication more than our raw strength, Ravel cautioned, during the preparation session the evening before, reviewing what limited intelligence existed on their upcoming opponents. Illusion-based peerages typically aim to fracture coordination rather than overpower it directly. If they can make us doubt what we are actually seeing, our new flexible formation becomes considerably more dangerous to execute rather than less. The match, when it finally began, proved exactly as challenging as Ravel had predicted, the opposing peerage's bishop weaving convincing illusory duplicates across the arena within moments of the opening signal, forcing Issei and the rest of the team to rely on senses beyond simple sight to track genuine threats amid the deliberately confusing battlefield. Trust the bond, Ravel's voice came steady through the coordination line, cutting cleanly through the visual chaos. Illusions cannot replicate genuine magical signature. Listen for what I am actually telling you, not what your eyes are showing you. It was, Issei realized, exactly the kind of trust the entire preceding year had been quietly building toward, and he found himself moving through the illusion-riddled arena guided almost entirely by Ravel's steady voice and the deeper, wordless awareness that had grown between them since her reincarnation, striking cleanly through duplicated afterimages toward targets his eyes alone could never have reliably identified. The match ended in a hard-fought but ultimately decisive victory, the opposing peerage's illusions proving, in the end, no match for a bond built on considerably more than simple visual coordination, and the post-match commentary, Issei noted with quiet satisfaction, began referring to the Gremory peerage's unusual reliance on what several analysts termed instinctive trust coordination, a phrase that would follow them with growing respect through the tournament's increasingly demanding final rounds. The official announcement of the new rating game season arrived a month later, welcome, ordinary business amid the lingering unease of Azazel's revelations, and Rias, reviewing the tournament bracket with evident enthusiasm, seemed genuinely relieved for the distraction of a conventional, structured challenge after weeks of vague, unresolved threat. This season's format is different, she explained, spreading the official tournament documentation across the clubroom table. Rather than the usual open bracket, this year's season includes a special invitational division for peerages who distinguished themselves in recent conflicts. Given everything that happened with Ouroboros, we've been formally invited to compete. Against who? Kiba asked, studying the preliminary bracket with keen professional interest. Several notable houses. Sona's peerage, unsurprisingly. Vala's independent team, competing under special dispensation given his unusual status. And a scattering of other great house peerages who've been building reputations of their own this past year. Rias's eyes gleamed with the particular competitive focus Issei had come to associate with her at her sharpest. It's a considerable honor to be included, and a considerable opportunity to prove, definitively, exactly how far this peerage has come since the difficulties of last year. The prospect of a formal tournament season brought with it a welcome return to structured, focused training, and Ravel, settling into her established role as the peerage's primary tactical coordinator, threw herself into tournament preparation with characteristic thoroughness. We need to account for the fact that every peerage in this division has likely studied our recent engagements closely, she cautioned, during one of the early strategy sessions. The coordination tactics that worked against Ouroboros as operatives are no longer a surprise to anyone paying attention. We need new wrinkles, new approaches they will not have had opportunity to study in advance. It was Issei, somewhat to his own surprise, who suggested the first genuine innovation, drawing on lessons learned not from formal tactical training but from the messy, hard-won experience of the past year's difficulties. What if we stop relying on me as a fixed anchor point, he proposed, during a late evening strategy session that had stretched well past its planned conclusion. Ravel's always had me hold the center, and it works, but everyone who's studied us knows that by now. What if the anchor point moves, depending on the fight, and we train to adapt to whoever is actually best positioned in the moment instead of defaulting to the same formation every time? Ravel considered this with evident, genuine interest, already sketching rough variations across her ever-present notebook. That would require considerably more flexible communication between all of us, she said slowly, working through the tactical implications. But it is, I think, precisely the kind of unpredictability that would genuinely trouble opponents who have prepared specifically to counter our established patterns. Rias, watching the exchange with visible pride, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. A year ago, she observed quietly, mostly to herself, I don't think Issei would have trusted his own tactical instincts enough to propose something like that in front of the whole team. She looked to Ravel, warmth evident in her expression. You've built something remarkable in him. In all of us, honestly. He built it himself, Ravel corrected, though there was clear pride in her voice as well. I simply gave him the tools and got out of his way once he learned how to use them properly. The tournament's opening rounds proceeded through the following weeks with a steady, satisfying momentum, the peerage's new flexible formation proving, exactly as Ravel had predicted, genuinely difficult for opponents to counter, having prepared primarily against their previously established patterns. Their first match, against a lesser-known peerage from a minor great house, ended in a decisive, clean victory that drew notable attention across underworld tournament circles, commentators remarking pointedly on the unusual fluidity of the Gremory peerage's coordination compared to previous seasons. They are already adjusting their scouting reports, Ravel observed, reviewing post-match commentary with clinical satisfaction. Good. Let them waste resources trying to identify a pattern that changes specifically to avoid being identified. The second round brought a considerably tougher test, a peerage built around overwhelming physical power that pressed the Gremory formation hard through the match's early stages, forcing genuine, improvised adaptation rather than simply executing a pre-planned strategy. Issei found himself, partway through the match, unexpectedly serving as the team's secondary anchor rather than its primary one, Kiba's sore work holding the center while Issei and Ravel worked the flanks together with a coordination that had grown, over months of shared training and now marriage besides, almost instinctive. Left flank collapsing, Ravel's voice came sharp through the coordination line, already moving to cover the gap before Issei had fully processed the shift himself, and he found, following her lead without hesitation, that the trust between them had grown deep enough now that second-guessing had become almost entirely unnecessary. They won that match too, narrower than the first but no less decisive, and the victory carried a different kind of satisfaction than their earlier win, the genuine test of adaptability under real pressure confirming everything the new flexible approach had promised in theory. Vala's team, watching from the sidelines as an interested observer rather than a competitor in that particular round, offered a rare, genuine compliment afterward. You've gotten considerably more interesting to watch, Vala told Issei, something like real respect in his usually detached expression. I look forward to whatever round eventually pits us against each other properly. Try not to sound too disappointed when I win, Issei said, grinning, the old easy rivalry as comfortable now as it had ever been. We shall see, Vala said, though something almost like a genuine smile crossed his face as he turned to leave, whose confidence proves better founded. The semi-final round arrived with considerably higher stakes, both teams having advanced through increasingly difficult competition, and the opposing peerage, led by a scion of one of the oldest great houses still actively competing in tournament circles, proved to be genuinely, seriously formidable in a way their previous opponents had not. But it was not the difficulty of the match itself that ultimately proved most consequential. It was what happened in its immediate aftermath, the Gremory peerage having secured a hard-fought, narrow victory, that changed the trajectory of everything that followed. Azazel found them in the tournament's private staging area almost the moment the match concluded, his expression grave enough that the team's exhausted, celebratory mood evaporated instantly. We have a problem, he said, without preamble. A significant one. My contacts just confirmed the identity of Ouroboros as true leadership. It's not who any of us expected. He paused, visibly bracing himself before continuing. It's Damon Vashti's father. Head of House Vashti. The same house whose son challenged your peerage to that rating game last year, believing you had grown weak from internal conflict. The revelation landed like a physical blow. That doesn't make sense, Rias said slowly, working through the implications. Damon's challenge was months before we even encountered Ouroboros directly. I don't think it was coincidence, Azazel said grimly. I think House Vashti has been quietly assessing your peerage's capabilities for considerably longer than any of us realized, using Damon's rating game challenge as an early test, gathering data that fed directly into everything Ouroboros later did against you. Vane's facility, the warehouse trap, all of it likely built on intelligence first gathered through that supposedly ordinary tournament match. Ravel's expression had gone hard and focused, old tactical instincts sharpening immediately. And now his own son competes in the same tournament bracket as us this season, she said slowly, the pieces settling into place with unwelcome clarity. That is not coincidence either. If House Vashti orchestrated their placement specifically to create another opportunity for direct observation, or worse, direct confrontation under the cover of legitimate competition, then we need to assume the semi-final bracket was never simply random, Rias finished, grim resolve settling across her expression. Which means our next match, if the bracket holds as currently structured, puts us directly against House Vashti's peerage. Directly against the true architect of everything Ouroboros has done against us this past year. The staging area fell silent, the weight of the revelation settling heavy across the entire team, until Issei, jaw set with quiet, steady determination, finally spoke. Then we finish this properly, he said. Not through some secret facility raid. Right there, in the open, in front of every witness this tournament draws. Let everyone see exactly what House Vashti has actually been doing behind their legitimate underworld standing. Ravel's hand found his, steady and certain despite the gravity of what lay ahead. Agreed, she said. We have spent an entire year learning to fight as a genuine team, tested against exactly the kind of patient, coordinated threat House Vashti represents. If this is truly where it finally ends, I would rather end it decisively, with the whole underworld watching, than through any further shadowy confrontation. The days leading up to the final confirmed match brought attention unlike anything the tournament had produced thus far, the entire peerage aware now that whatever unfolded in that arena would carry consequences reaching far beyond a simple rating game victory. We cannot approach this as purely a combat problem, Ravel cautioned, during an intense final strategy session that stretched deep into the night before the match. If Lord Vashti is indeed the true architect behind Ouroboros, he will not simply throw his peerage at us recklessly. He will use this match as he has used every prior engagement, as an opportunity to gather final data, to probe for weaknesses he can exploit later regardless of the match's formal outcome. So what's the actual plan? Kiba asked, tension evident in his voice despite months of hard-won composure. We give him nothing new to study, Ravel said. We have spent this entire tournament season deliberately cultivating unpredictability specifically to counter exactly this kind of long-term observation. Tomorrow, we do not simply win. We demonstrate, definitively, that whatever advantage he believes his careful data gathering has provided him no longer applies. Azazel, present for the final preparations despite his usual reluctance to involve himself directly in tournament matters, added his own grim addition to the briefing. I've alerted the Tournament Oversight Committee to what we've uncovered, he said. They won't intervene preemptively. Formal rating games carry too much political weight for that kind of unilateral action based on unconfirmed intelligence. But they will be watching closely, and if Lord Vashti's peerage does anything that crosses clearly beyond the bounds of legitimate competition, there will be immediate consequences waiting. Rias, surveying her assembled peerage with the same steady resolve that had carried them through every difficulty of the past year, finally spoke, her voice carrying clearly across the room. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said, I want each of you to remember exactly how far we have come to reach this moment. A year ago, this team could not have withstood a single hard evening of internal criticism without fracturing. Tomorrow, we face the architect of a threat that has hunted us for months, and I have never been more confident in any team I have ever led. Her gaze settled, briefly but meaningfully, on Issei and Ravel standing together near the room's center. We do this properly. Together. And whatever house Vashti has spent all this time trying to learn about us, tomorrow, we make certain the lesson they actually receive is one they will not soon forget. The room fell quiet after that, each member of the peerage settling into their own private preparations for what lay ahead, and Issei, walking home with Ravel through the quiet, dark streets of Ko that night, found himself thinking, unexpectedly, of the frightened, isolated boy who had once sat alone on a shrine's stone steps, utterly certain he had nowhere left to turn. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said quietly, I wanted you to know none of this, any of it, the tournament, the wedding, any of the good things this past year, would have happened without you deciding, that first night, that I was worth stopping for. Ravel leaned into him, her hand finding his in the cool night air. And none of it would have happened, she said softly, without you deciding, every single day since, that you were worth fighting for too. That was always the harder part, Issei. I simply helped you see it. The arena for the confirmed semi-final match drew the largest crowd the tournament season had yet produced, word of the unusual circumstances surrounding the pairing having spread, in careful, coded whispers, through underworld social circles despite Azazel's efforts to keep the true stakes contained. Lord Vashti himself stood at the edge of the arena as the match's designated overseer for his own peerage, his composed, aristocratic bearing giving away nothing of the accusations quietly gathering weight against him. And when his eyes met Issei's across the arena floor, something cold and calculating flickered behind his carefully neutral expression. An honor to finally compete against the peerage that has caused my family such considerable trouble this past year, Lord Vashti said, his tone smooth and unbothered, clearly intended for the watching crowd rather than any genuine sentiment. My son's earlier defeat at your hands has weighed on our house's pride for some time. I confess I look forward to seeing that particular record corrected today. We'll see about that, Rias said evenly, giving no indication that she knew considerably more about Lord Vashti's true motivations than his careful public performance suggested. The match began the moment the arena's signal sounded, and it was immediately apparent that Lord Vashti's peerage, for all their formal tournament credentials, fought with a coordination that carried an unmistakable, unsettling familiarity, tactics that mirrored, almost precisely, the same patient, probing approach Ouroboros' operatives had employed across every prior encounter. They're testing our formation exactly the way I expected. Ravel's voice came sharp and focused through the coordination line, already adjusting the team's positioning in response. Do not give them the pattern they are looking for. Issei, hold center for exactly one exchange, then rotate to the left flank the moment their rook commits. The team executed the shifting, unpredictable formation with a fluid precision that had grown, over the tournament's preceding rounds, into genuine instinct, and Lord Vashti's peerage, having clearly prepared extensively based on months of accumulated observation, found themselves increasingly unable to anticipate a team that had deliberately, systematically made itself impossible to fully predict. It was Ravel, reading the shifting battle with the same tactical brilliance that had first helped rebuild the entire peerage's coordination months earlier, who finally identified the opening that would decide the match, a subtle overextension from Lord Vashti's queen piece, clearly positioned to gather final data on Ravel's own fire magic rather than to genuinely press an advantage. Now, Ravel called, and the team converged with practiced, devastating precision, Kiba and Kaneko cutting off the queen's retreat while Issei and Ravel drove directly through the exposed gap, boosted gear and phoenix fire combining in a coordinated strike that ended the exchange decisively before Lord Vashti's peerage could fully process what had happened. The match's momentum shifted entirely from that point forward, the Gremory peerage pressing their advantage with a coordinated relentlessness that gave Lord Vashti's forces no opportunity to recover, and when the final piece finally fell, the arena's formal victory signal ringing out clear across the stunned, murmuring crowd, the outcome was unambiguous in a way that left no room for graceful dismissal. Lord Vashti's composed mask finally cracked, something cold and furious flashing behind his eyes as he approached the arena's center to offer the formally required concession. A well-fought match, he said, voice tight with barely restrained anger, entirely unconvincing to anyone paying close attention. It was, Rias agreed, meeting his gaze steadily, something sharp and deliberate in her own tone. Though I suspect, Lord Vashti, that we will be having a rather different conversation soon, one considerably less bound by tournament formalities. Something flickered across Lord Vashti's expression, brief but unmistakable, confirmation enough that every suspicion Azazel's investigation had gathered was, indeed, entirely accurate. He said nothing further, offering only a stiff, formal nod before turning to depart the arena, his retreating figure trailed by murmuring speculation from the watching crowd, who had clearly sensed, even without full understanding of the true stakes, that something considerably weightier than a simple tournament match had just concluded. Ravel watched him go, something hard and satisfied settling into her expression. "He knows we know," she said quietly, mostly to Issei. "Whatever comes next, he will not have the luxury of pretending otherwise any longer." The formal accusation, when it finally came 3 days later, arrived through proper underworld judicial channels. Azazel's accumulated evidence, combined with testimony extracted from the previously silent Ouroboros commander once confronted with irrefutable proof of his true leadership's exposure, proving sufficient to compel a full judicial inquiry into House Vashti's activities. Lord Vashti did not go quietly. The confrontation, when underworld enforcement finally moved against the Vashti estate, escalated rapidly into open conflict. Lord Vashti's personal guard, augmented by whatever remained of Ouroboros' operational resources, resisting the arrest attempt with a desperate, coordinated ferocity that made clear exactly how much he had invested in the operation's continued secrecy. The Gremory peerage, called in alongside Sona's team and a contingent of formal underworld enforcement, found themselves once more in genuine combat, the estate's grounds transformed into a chaotic battlefield as Lord Vashti's forces fought with the particular desperation of people who understood, clearly, that capture meant complete and total exposure. Issei found Lord Vashti himself in the estate's inner sanctum, the man's composed aristocratic bearing entirely abandoned now, replaced by something colder and more dangerous, magic gathering with barely restrained violence at his fingertips. "You should have simply let my son's earlier defeat stand as the end of this," Lord Vashti snarled, all pretense of civility finally, fully discarded. "Instead you exposed an operation that would have secured my house's standing for generations, cataloging, understanding, eventually surpassing every Longinus wielder foolish enough to remain complacent about their own vulnerability. You have cost me everything I spent years carefully building." "You spent years hunting people," Issei said, boosted gear roaring to life, Ravel already moving to flank the confrontation with fierce, focused precision. Ravel included. "You don't get to talk about that like it was some kind of noble research project." The fight that followed was brief but genuinely dangerous. Lord Vashti's own considerable combat ability, honed over centuries of underworld political maneuvering, proving a serious threat even against the combined force arrayed against him. But months, now a full year, of hard-won trust and coordination between Issei and Ravel proved, ultimately, decisive, their combined strike finally overwhelming Lord Vashti's defenses entirely, leaving him subdued and disarmed as underworld enforcement moved in to complete the arrest. "It's over," Ravel said, breathing hard, surveying the estate's ruined inner sanctum with grim, hard-won satisfaction. "Genuinely, finally over." "Yeah," Issei said, pulling her close amid the settling dust and chaos, relief flooding through him fully for what felt like the first time in over a year of accumulating threat and uncertainty. "It is." The weeks that followed brought a settling, gradual return to genuine, uncomplicated peace, House Vashti's formal dissolution proceeding through underworld judicial channels with a thoroughness that left little doubt the threat had been comprehensively, permanently addressed. Lord Vashti's remaining assets and holdings redistributed among the houses whose territories his operations had quietly violated over the preceding year. Damon Vashti himself, stripped of his family's standing but apparently uninvolved in his father's secret operations, sought Issei out unexpectedly one afternoon, his usual arrogance entirely absent, replaced by something considerably more subdued. "I did not know," he said, without preamble, standing awkwardly at the edge of the Co-Academy grounds, "about any of it. My father's operations, the surveillance, any of it. I want you to know that, whatever else you think of me after our duel." "I believe you," Issei said, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he genuinely meant it. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Losing your family's standing like that, even if your father earned it." Damon studied him for a long moment, something unreadable working behind his expression. "You are more gracious than I deserve, given how our previous encounter ended," he said finally. "I find myself reconsidering, rather more seriously than I would like to admit, certain assumptions I have carried my entire life about what actually constitutes genuine worth." He offered a stiff, formal bow, entirely unlike his earlier contempt. "I wish you and Lady Phoenix, Lady Hyoudou now, I suppose, considerable happiness." "Genuinely. What will you do now?" Issei asked, curious despite himself. "Without your family standing behind you?" Damon considered the question for a long moment, something almost like relief crossing his usually guarded expression. "I have not entirely decided," he admitted. "There is, I find, a certain freedom in no longer having an entire house's expectations riding on every choice I make. I may pursue independent combat certification. I understand there are peerages willing to take on promising fighters regardless of formal noble standing, provided they can prove themselves capable." A faint, self-deprecating smile crossed his face. "Perhaps I will finally learn whether I am actually skilled, or whether I simply believed myself skilled because everyone around me was too polite to suggest otherwise." "For what it's worth," Issei said, "you were a genuinely tough opponent in that duel. Whatever else was going on with your family, that part was real." Damon's expression shifted, something like genuine gratitude flickering behind his composed exterior. "Thank you," he said, quiet and sincere. "I did not expect kindness from you, after everything. I find I appreciate it more than I know how to properly express." It was, Issei thought, watching Damon walk away, an unexpected but not unwelcome coda to an entire year of accumulated conflict finally, fully resolving into something that resembled, at long last, genuine peace. That evening, Issei found Ravel on the balcony of their apartment, watching the ordinary lights of Ko spread out beneath the darkening sky, and joined her there, wrapping his arms around her from behind, feeling her lean back into him with the easy, comfortable trust that had grown between them across an entire eventful year. "It's strange," she said quietly, "to finally have nothing urgent left to plan for. No threat looming, no tournament to prepare for, no family crisis requiring careful navigation. Just this. Ordinary evenings. Ordinary life." "Feels earned," Issei said, resting his chin against her shoulder. "It does," Ravel agreed, turning in his arms to face him properly, something soft and certain in her expression. "I have been thinking, actually, about what comes next for us. Not threats. Not tournaments. Simply, what we want to build together now that we finally have room to build something beyond crisis and survival." "Yeah," Issei said, smiling, pulling her close beneath the darkening evening sky. "I've been thinking about that too." Behind them, the lights of Ko continued their ordinary, comfortable glow, an entire life stretching ahead of them now, finally unburdened by the shadow of Ouroboros or old grievances or fractured trust, only the steady, quiet promise of everything still waiting to be built, together, one ordinary, hard-won evening at a time. The tournament's final match, delayed by 2 weeks while the underworld judicial system worked through the immediate aftermath of House Vashti's dissolution, eventually resumed with the Gremory peerage facing Sona's team in a contest that carried, after everything that had come before it, an almost welcome simplicity. 2 peerages who genuinely respected each other competing purely for the sake of the sport itself, free of any hidden agenda or lingering threat. "It feels strange," Rias admitted, reviewing the final match preparations with Sona over tea in a rare, informal planning session between the 2 old friends, to actually just be excited about a raiding game again, without wondering what it might secretly be covering for. "A welcome change, I think," Sona said, allowing herself a small, genuine smile. "Though I hope you understand I intend to give you no quarter simply because we have both had a difficult season." "I would be disappointed if you did," Rias said, grinning. The final match itself proved everything a tournament final should be, hard-fought and genuinely competitive from the opening signal, Sona's precise, methodical strategy testing the Gremory peerage's hard-won flexibility at every turn, and the outcome, when it finally arrived after a grueling, closely contested battle, came down to a final exchange between Issei and Sona's queen that drew the largest, most enthusiastic response the tournament season had yet produced. The Gremory peerage emerged victorious, narrowly but unambiguously, and the celebration that followed, unburdened for the first time all season by any looming secondary threat, carried a lightness that felt, to Issei, like the truest culmination of everything the past year had built toward. Champions, Aquino said, raising a celebratory glass amid the gathered team's exhausted, delighted laughter. After everything. We actually did it. We did it together, Rias corrected, though there was no real argument in the room, only shared, hard-won joy. Every single one of us. That's the part one intend to remember longest about this particular season. Kaneko, uncharacteristically talkative amid the celebration, raised her own glass with quiet, evident satisfaction. Best season, she said simply. Glad I got to be part of it. Kiba, standing close beside her, nodded in easy agreement. A year ago I wasn't sure this peerage would survive the fallout from one bad night, he admitted, something reflective in his voice despite the celebration's warmth. Watching us end up here instead, champions, genuinely closer than we've ever been, that's not something I take for granted anymore. Gasper, steadier now than he had been in all the months Issei had known him, offered his own small but genuine addition to the toast. I used to think I'd always just be the one hiding in the corner, he said, a little shy but entirely sincere. I'm glad that's not true anymore. I'm glad I got to actually help, this time, instead of just watching. You did more than help, Ravel said warmly, raising her own glass toward him. You held that barrier steady through an entire semi-final match under real pressure. That is not a small thing, Gasper. Do not let yourself believe otherwise. Gasper flushed, pleased and a little overwhelmed, and the celebration continued around them, warm and unguarded, every member of the peerage settling into the particular, hard-won satisfaction of a difficult year finally, fully rewarded. Ravel, standing close beside Issei amid the celebration, found his hand and squeezed it once, quiet satisfaction shining clear in her expression. A tournament championship, she said, on top of everything else this past year has brought us. I begin to think, Issei Hyoudou, that there is very little the two of us cannot accomplish, provided we continue facing it together rather than apart. Yeah, Issei said, pulling her close amid the celebration's warm, easy noise. I think you might be right about that. Around them the celebration continued long into the evening, exhaustion and joy tangled together in equal measure, every member of the peerage finally allowing themselves the simple, uncomplicated relief of a season's difficulty successfully weathered, together, exactly as they had faced everything else this past year had asked of them. The formal championship ceremony, held 3 days later in one of the underworld's grand public halls, drew a crowd considerably larger than any single tournament match had managed, word of the season's dramatic, unexpected turns having spread thoroughly through underworld social circles by then, transforming what would ordinarily have been a modest sporting event into something closer to genuine spectacle. Sirzex Lucifer himself, attending in his capacity as both reigning Satan and Rias's own elder brother, offered the formal championship address, his warm, easy charisma carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. This season tested every peerage that competed in ways considerably beyond the usual demands of tournament play, he said, his gaze settling, with evident pride, on his sister's assembled team standing at the ceremony's center. I am endlessly proud, not simply of the tactical brilliance this peerage demonstrated across their matches, though that alone would be considerable cause for pride, but of the resilience, the genuine, hard-won unity, that carried them through challenges no tournament format could have anticipated. Rias, and every member of your peerage, you have my deepest congratulations, and my deepest gratitude for the courage this season ultimately required of all of you. The formal trophy, presented amid warm, sustained applause, found its way eventually into Rias's hands, and she turned immediately to share the moment with her assembled team. The trophy passed carefully from hand to hand as each member took their own quiet moment with the tangible proof of everything they had built together. When it finally reached Ravel, she held it for a long moment, something reflective crossing her expression before she turned to find Issei watching her with open, unguarded pride. A year ago, she said quietly, meant only for him amid the surrounding ceremony's noise, I was a liaison officer wondering whether I would ever be more than useful to the people around me. Now I stand here holding a championship trophy earned alongside a family I chose, married to a man who taught me, more than anyone else in my entire life, exactly what it means to be valued simply for existing. She smiled, bright and entirely unguarded. I do not believe I could have imagined, that first night on the shrine steps, exactly how far this particular story would eventually carry us. Neither could I, Issei admitted, pulling her close amid the ceremony's warm, celebratory noise. But I'm glad it did. Around them, the assembled crowd continued its warm applause, the entire peerage basking in hard-won, thoroughly earned recognition, and somewhere beneath the ceremony's public spectacle, in the quiet space that belonged only to the two of them, Issei and Ravel simply held each other, grateful, steady, and finally, after everything, entirely at peace. The quiet that settled over their lives in the weeks following the championship carried a texture neither of them had experienced before, not the tense, watchful calm of provisional peace they had grown accustomed to over the preceding year, but something genuinely, sustainably settled. Issei found himself, for the first time since boosted gear had first manifested on his arm years earlier, able to imagine an ordinary future stretching ahead of him without immediately bracing for whatever crisis might interrupt it. School continued its familiar rhythms. Training continued too, though with a steadier, more sustainable pace than the desperate intensity of the preceding year's crises had demanded. The apartment slowly filled with the accumulated small evidence of a genuinely shared life, photographs from both weddings displayed carefully alongside mismatched furniture neither of them had quite gotten around to properly coordinating, a chaotic but comfortable testament to two very different worlds finding their own particular balance. Ravel's own life, freed from the shadow of Ouroboros and her own family's complicated expectations both, blossomed in ways that continued to surprise even her. Her tactical consulting work expanded steadily, requests arriving now from peerages across the region rather than simply within Rias's immediate circle, and she approached each new challenge with the same disciplined, thorough focus she had once brought exclusively to Issei's own training. You have built quite a reputation, Riser observed, during one of his increasingly frequent, increasingly warm visits to Co., watching his sister review a formal consulting request with evident professional satisfaction. I confess, watching you now, I find myself wondering whether our family's succession plans ever truly suited you as well as this path clearly does. They did not, Ravel said, without hesitation, though there was no bitterness in it, only settled, hard-won clarity. I simply did not know that until I had something to compare it against. Rias, for her part, continued steering her peerage through the ordinary business of underworld devil life with the same steady confidence that had, over the past year, been so carefully and deliberately rebuilt, and the easy warmth that had once defined her relationship with Issei before the rail yard mission's difficulties had returned, transformed now into something even sturdier, tempered by genuine hardship weathered and survived together. I keep thinking about that night on the shrine steps, she admitted to Issei one quiet afternoon, the two of them reviewing routine peerage business in the familiar comfort of the old clubroom. The one where you told me you didn't think there was much left to talk about until someone in that room understood why you needed to matter to somebody. I think about it more than you probably realize. Why? Issei asked, genuinely curious. Because it was the beginning of the best mistake I ever learned from, Rias said, something warm and reflective in her expression. I failed you that night. But watching everything that grew out of that failure, watching you build the kind of unshakable trust with Ravel that carried this entire peerage through an actual conspiracy, a wedding under attack, a championship season, I find I cannot entirely regret how it began, even though I wish, every day, that I had spoken up sooner. She met his eyes steadily. You built something remarkable out of a room that let you down, Issei. I hope you know how proud that makes me, even now. Issei considered this for a long moment, old memory of that fractured, lonely night settling differently now, transformed by everything that had grown from it. I think, he said slowly, I needed to learn that my worth didn't depend on any one room's approval. Ravel taught me that. But you taught me something too, eventually. That the people who fail you sometimes still deserve the chance to become better, if they're willing to actually try. He smiled. You tried. That's most of what actually matters, in the end. Rias's answering smile carried the particular warmth of hard-won understanding, and outside the clubroom windows, the ordinary afternoon light of Co continued its steady, comfortable glow, an entire found family settled, at long last, into something genuinely, sustainably whole, Every fracture that had once threatened to break them permanently transformed, instead, into the very foundation the rest of their shared future would be built upon. Autumn settled slowly over Ko in the weeks that followed, the town's ordinary rhythms carrying on entirely unaware of everything the past year had asked of the small group of devils quietly woven through its streets. And Issei found himself, more often than not lately, simply grateful for the sheer ordinariness of it all. He and Ravel had fallen into a comfortable weekend routine, mornings spent training together at the old shed behind the Hyoudou house out of habit more than necessity now. The exacting discipline of Ravel's early lessons long since settled into something closer to shared ritual than urgent preparation. Afterward, more often than not, they wandered into town together, no particular destination in mind, content simply to exist in each other's company without any crisis demanding their immediate attention. "I never properly thanked you," Ravel said, on one such afternoon, the two of them sharing a bench near the old shrine, close enough to the very steps where everything between them had first genuinely begun that the symmetry rarely escaped either of them. For that first night. For trusting a stranger enough to tell her the truth about how badly that clubroom meeting had gone. "You didn't feel like a stranger," Issei said. "Not really. Not even that first night." "No," Ravel agreed, something soft in her expression. "I do not suppose I did to you either." She was quiet for a moment, watching the ordinary evening traffic of the street below. "I have been thinking, lately, about everything that grew out of that single evening. A engagement. 2 weddings. A tournament championship. An entire criminal conspiracy dismantled, more or less by accident, because a group of frightened, angry teenagers refused to stay quiet about being wronged." She laughed softly. "It is rather a lot, when I lay it out plainly like that." "Yeah," Issei said, laughing too. "When you put it that way, it kind of is." "Do you ever wonder," Ravel asked, more serious now, "what might have happened if I had not found you on those steps that night? If I had simply walked past, the way anyone reasonably occupied with their own concerns might have?" Issei considered the question seriously, turning it over with the same careful honesty he had learned, gradually, over their entire shared history together. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "I don't know where I'd have ended up. Probably still stuck in that same fractured place for a lot longer than I actually was. Maybe I'd have found my way out of it eventually on my own. Maybe I wouldn't have." He reached for her hand, steady and certain. "I'm just glad I don't have to know the answer to that." "Because you did stop. You did ask. And everything good that's happened since started with that one choice." Ravel leaned into him, her head finding its familiar place against his shoulder, the last of the evening light stretching long and gold across the quiet street below. "I am glad too," she said simply. "More glad than I have adequate words to properly express, honestly, though I have certainly had a full year of practice trying." They sat together a while longer, comfortable in the settling autumn evening, and eventually, as the first stars began to emerge overhead, rose together to walk the familiar route home, hand in hand, unhurried, with nothing more urgent waiting for them than the simple, hard-won pleasure of an ordinary evening shared between two people who had, against considerable odds and no small amount of difficulty, finally built something that felt, at long last, entirely and permanently their own. The summons arrived through official underworld government channels on a crisp autumn morning, considerably more formal than the usual liaison correspondence, and Rias's expression as she read it shifted, over the course of a few silent minutes, from curiosity to something that looked distinctly like pride. "They want to see you," she said finally, looking up at Issei across the clubroom desk. "The Underworld Council. Formally. Regarding a promotion review." "A promotion to what?" Issei asked, genuinely uncertain. "High-class devil status, independent of my peerage." Rias set the letter down carefully, as though handling something considerably weightier than paper. "Issei, this is the same formal recognition that eventually allows the devil to build and lead their own peerage. It's rarely offered this early in a reincarnated devil's career. The council doesn't extend this kind of consideration lightly." Ravel, seated beside Issei, went very still, something complicated moving behind her carefully composed expression. "They are offering him his own house," she said slowly, working through the implications with her usual rapid precision. "After everything this past year, the Ouroboros conflict, the tournament championship, they have decided his contributions warrant full independent standing. Is that a good thing? Issei asked, watching the careful way both women were processing the news. It is an extraordinary thing, Rias said, something warm and genuinely proud entering her voice despite the complicated undertone. It means the underworld government considers you to have not just survived this past year's difficulties, but to have demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and capability expected of someone ready to build something of their own. She paused, something more bittersweet flickering across her expression before she continued. It also means, if you accept, that you would no longer formally be a member of my peerage. You would need your own evil pieces, your own devils to lead. A genuine, independent house, separate from Gremory. The weight of that landed slowly, and Issei found himself turning the idea over with considerably more uncertainty than the straightforward honor of the offer might have suggested. I don't know if I want that, he admitted. Not if it means leaving all of you behind. That is not necessarily how it would have to work, Ravel said carefully, though something in her voice suggested she was still working through her own complicated feelings about the possibility. Devils sometimes transfer between peerages when circumstances change significantly. It would not be unheard of for some members of Rias's current peerage to choose to join your new house, if that is a path you eventually decided to pursue. Rias, watching the exchange with an expression that mixed genuine pride with unmistakable, carefully controlled sadness, finally spoke. I won't pretend the idea of you leaving my peerage doesn't affect me, she said honestly. You've been my pawn since the very beginning, Issei. Watching you grow into someone the council considers ready for independent standing, that's one of the proudest things I've witnessed in my entire time as a devil. But I also won't hold you back from something you've clearly earned, out of my own reluctance to let go. She met his eyes steadily. Whatever you decide, I want you to make the choice based on what's right for you, and for whoever you'd want to build this new house alongside, not based on worry about disappointing me. Aquino, present for the briefing though largely quiet throughout, offered her own gentle addition before the meeting concluded. For what it is worth, she said, I think this house has already given you everything it could reasonably offer you, Issei. Not because there is nothing left to learn here, but because some lessons only fully take root once you are forced to stand on your own and prove you actually absorbed them, rather than simply borrowing our example. She smiled, warm and genuine. I suspect you already know that, somewhere beneath all the understandable hesitation. Issei considered her words carefully, something settling clearer in his chest than it had been throughout the entire preceding conversation. Yeah, he admitted. I think I do. The decision, when it finally came, took nearly 2 weeks of careful consideration, conversation stretching late into countless evenings between Issei and Ravel, and eventually, more difficult still, between Issei and the rest of the peerage he had spent an entire eventful year building genuine trust with. I keep thinking about the rail yard, Issei admitted to Ravel one evening, the two of them sitting together on their apartment balcony, the question of the council's offer still unresolved between them. About how alone I felt that first night. I don't want building my own house to mean losing what we all built back from that. I don't want it to feel like starting over from fractured, just in a different shape. It would not have to, Ravel said gently. But I think, if I am honest, some version of that fear is inevitable, whenever anyone builds something genuinely new rather than simply inheriting what already exists. The question is not whether the uncertainty exists. It is whether you trust yourself, and the people who would choose to build this with you, enough to face that uncertainty without repeating old mistakes. Would you come with me? Issei asked, the question he had been circling for days finally spoken plainly. If I did this, would you want to be part of it, or would you rather stay with Rias's peerage? Ravel considered the question with evident seriousness, no immediate reflexive answer offered despite what Issei suspected was already a fairly settled conviction. I have thought about very little else since the council's letter arrived, she admitted. I chose Rias's peerage once already, for reasons that remain entirely valid. She offered me a home when I needed one, a chance to be valued for myself rather than my family's name. I do not regret that choice. She turned to face him more fully. But if you build something of your own, Issei, I find I want to be part of that too, not simply as your wife watching from the sidelines, but as an active builder of whatever this new house becomes. I would want to serve as your queen, if you would have me, rather than remaining a bishop in someone else's peerage while you built your own house without me standing directly beside you in it. The offer, spoken so plainly, settled something uncertain in Issei's chest that he had not fully realized was still unresolved. I'd want that, he said, quiet and certain. More than anything, honestly. I don't think I could imagine building this without you as part of it. Rias, when Issei finally brought the full shape of his decision to her, listened with the same careful, generous attention she had shown throughout the entire process, and though the sadness in her expression remained clearly visible, so too did something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine pride. I release Ravel from my peerage, if that is truly what both of you want, she said, after a long, considering silence. It seems fitting, in a strange way, that she would be the one to help you build this next chapter, given everything she helped you build in the last one. Thank you, Issei said, meaning it more deeply than the simple words could fully convey. Don't thank me yet, Rias said, though there was warmth rather than sharpness in it. Building a peerage from nothing is considerably harder than inheriting an established one, Issei. You're about to learn that firsthand. Kiba, who had remained quiet throughout most of the difficult conversation, offered his own parting thought as the meeting finally drew to its close. For what it's worth, he said, I think you're going to be good at this. Better than you probably expect. You've spent this whole year learning exactly what a peerage needs to actually hold together. That's not nothing, going into something like this. Thanks, Kiba, Issei said, genuinely touched. That means a lot, coming from you especially. The formal reincarnation ceremony that transferred Ravel from Rias's peerage into Issei's own newly established house took place in the same clubroom where her original bishop piece had once settled, though the mood this time carried a very different weight. Ceremony and genuine sentiment tangled together in equal measure. I release you from my service, freely and with genuine gratitude for everything you have contributed to this peerage, Rias said formally, extracting the bishop piece with careful, practiced precision. And I wish you both every success in whatever you build together next. The transfer itself proceeded smoothly, Ravel's original bishop piece dissolving back into raw potential before Issei, standing at the center of his own newly formed summoning array for the first time, offered his own queen piece in its place, the underworld government's formal grant of evil pieces having arrived only days earlier alongside his official recognition as an independent high-class devil. Ravel Phoenix Hyoudou, he said, the formal wording feeling strange and significant in his mouth, will you accept reincarnation as Queen of House Hyoudou, of your own free will, understanding fully what this means for the house we are building together? I will, Ravel said, without a single flicker of hesitation, freely, and gladly, as I have chosen everything else about this particular life alongside you. The queen piece settled into her with a deep, resonant glow considerably more intense than the bishop piece's original transformation had carried, and when she opened her eyes again, something in her bearing had shifted subtly, power settling into her with the particular weight the queen piece's combined strengths always carried. That felt different, she said, testing the new sensation with evident interest, flexing fingers that now hummed with considerably more raw magical potential than before. More complete somehow. As though something that was always meant to fit together finally has. Welcome to House Hyoudou, Issei said, unable to keep the wonder entirely out of his voice, the strange, significant reality of the moment settling fully now that the formal ceremony had concluded. Officially. My first piece. Your only piece, currently, Ravel pointed out, practical even amid the ceremony's weight. We have, I believe, rather a lot of recruitment ahead of us, if this house is meant to become anything beyond the two of us standing in an empty clubroom. Issei laughed, some of the day's nervous formality finally easing into genuine, comfortable warmth. One step at a time, he said. We'll figure out the rest. Recruitment for House Hyoudou's remaining pieces proved considerably more complicated than either of them had initially anticipated, the process requiring not simply raw magical compatibility, but the kind of genuine trust and shared purpose that Issei, having learned the hard way exactly how badly a fractured peerage could suffer, refused to compromise on regardless of how much easier a purely pragmatic approach might have been. The first genuine candidate arrived unexpectedly, in the form of a formal request from Gasper, who sought Issei out with a directness that surprised them both. "I want to transfer," Gasper said, standing a little straighter than his usual habitual slouch, though clearly still working to summon the full measure of his nerve. "To your peerage. If you'll have me." "Gasper, you don't have to leave Rias's peerage on my account," Issei said, genuinely surprised. "You've built a real place there. I don't want you to feel like you owe me this." "I don't feel like I owe you anything," Gasper said, something steadier in his voice than Issei had heard from him in a long time. "I want to do this because of what I owe myself. I spent so long being the one who folded into corners, who let other people's silence decide what I was worth. You and Ravel showed me, this past year, what it looks like to actually claim your own worth instead of waiting for someone else to hand it to you." He met Issei's eyes directly, an act that would have been unthinkable from the Gasper of a year earlier. "I want to help build something new. Something I helped shape from the beginning, instead of just fitting into what already existed." Ravel, present for the conversation, exchanged a quiet, meaningful glance with Issei before speaking. "We would be honored to have you," she said simply, and the warmth in her voice left no doubt of her sincerity. Rias, when consulted about the transfer, offered her blessing with the same generous grace she had extended to Ravel's own transition weeks earlier, though not without a small, wistful smile. "I seem to be making a habit of releasing my most promising pieces to your growing house," she told Issei, amusement mixing with genuine warmth. "I suppose I should simply be grateful you keep choosing people worth building something significant around." The second addition to House Hyoudou arrived through considerably more unexpected channels. A young, newly reincarnated devil named Kaido Amano, formerly an ordinary human martial arts student whose exceptional natural talent had drawn underworld attention during a routine territorial patrol, and whose own family circumstances, considerably rougher and more difficult than his talent might have suggested, resonated with Issei in ways he found difficult to fully articulate. "He reminds me of myself, a little," Issei admitted to Ravel, after their first meeting with the earnest, hungry-eyed young man. "Not the power. The way he talks about wanting to matter to somebody. I remember that feeling." "Then perhaps," Ravel said, "he belongs somewhere that understands exactly how to nurture that, rather than exploit it." Kaido accepted reincarnation as House Hyoudou's first rook with an eagerness that reminded Issei, uncomfortably and fondly both, of his own earliest days as Rias's newest pawn, and the slow, careful process of building trust with him, teaching him the same hard-won lessons about earned strength and genuine belonging that Ravel had once taught Issei himself, became, over the following weeks, one of the most quietly rewarding experiences of Issei's entire year. The third and fourth members of House Hyoudou arrived together, twin sisters named Sakura and Suzu Ichinos, formerly minor operatives within a dissolved lesser house whose own downfall, entirely unconnected to the Vashti affair, had left them searching for a new peerage willing to overlook their house's diminished standing in favor of genuine capability. "Most established houses will not seriously consider us," Sakura, the elder of the two by mere minutes, explained during their initial meeting, a careful, guarded formality in her voice that Issei recognized, with a small pang, from his own early defensiveness before Ravel had first coaxed him into genuine trust. "Our former house's collapse carries a certain stigma, however unfair the actual circumstances. We understand if House Hyoudou prefers candidates without that particular complication. We're a house of one devil who used to be an ordinary human and a woman who gave up her own family's succession to be here," Issei said, unable to keep the wry humor entirely out of his voice. "I don't think either of us is exactly positioned to judge anyone else's complicated circumstances." The sisters, cautiously reassured, accepted reincarnation as House Hyoudou's remaining knight and second rook positions, their combined combat style, built around a rare, coordinated dual magic that neither sister could fully access alone, proving an immediate, valuable addition to the growing house's developing tactical identity. By the time the house's initial formation neared completion, 5 devils strong including Issei and Ravel themselves, Ravel had already begun sketching preliminary formation strategies with the same meticulous, thorough focus she had once brought exclusively to Issei's individual training. "We are considerably smaller than most established houses at this stage," she cautioned, reviewing the developing formation with critical, careful attention one evening in the small office space House Hyoudou had claimed within Koa's broader Devil administrative district. But smaller can mean more coordinated, if we build the trust between everyone properly from the very beginning rather than assuming it will simply develop naturally over time. That's kind of the whole point, right? Issei said. Building it properly this time. From the ground up. Precisely, Ravel agreed, something satisfied and determined in her expression. We know exactly what fractured trust costs a peerage, better than most houses ever have cause to learn firsthand. I intend to make certain House Hyoudou never has to relearn that particular lesson the hard way. Not every response to House Hyoudu's formation carried the warmth Issei had grown accustomed to from his own found family, and the first genuine friction arrived within weeks, delivered through the particular, careful condescension of underworld old guard politics. Several established houses have raised formal concerns, Sona informed Issei and Ravel during a courtesy briefing, her characteristic bluntness softened only slightly by evident sympathy. Nothing procedurally significant, your council recognition is entirely valid and unchallengeable. But there's considerable grumbling in certain circles about a reincarnated devil of common human origin being granted independent house status this quickly, particularly one recruiting so heavily from candidates with their own complicated standing. Let them grumble, Ravel said, sharp and entirely unbothered, echoing sentiments Issei recognized from her own earlier dismissal of the Baldavar controversy. We have weathered considerably more serious opposition than wounded aristocratic pride. The grumbling, however, eventually solidified into something more concrete, a formal challenge arriving from Lord Castellan, head of an old, established minor house whose public statements had grown increasingly pointed regarding what he termed the underworld's concerning trend toward, in his words, rewarding and proven upstarts with the same standing earned through generations of proper devil tradition. He wants to test House Hyoudu's legitimacy through formal combat, Rias explained, having intercepted the challenge through her own continued diplomatic channels before it reached Issei directly. A demonstration match, structured to prove, or disprove, whether your new house's council recognition was genuinely earned or simply the product of favorable timing following the Vashti scandal's fallout. He thinks we got lucky, Issei said, old, familiar frustration flaring despite months of hard-won equilibrium. He thinks considerably worse than that, if I am honest about the underlying sentiment, Ravel said, jaw tight. But the specific accusation matters less than how we respond to it. We accept, and we prove him decisively wrong, the same way we have proven every other doubter wrong across this entire eventful year. Kaido, present for the briefing and still relatively new to the particular texture of underworld political theater, looked between them with evident nervousness. Are we actually ready for something like that? He asked. We've barely finished forming as a house. We are ready, Ravel said, with the same absolute, steady confidence that had once carried Issei himself through considerably more dangerous confrontations than a single demonstration match. Because we are not fighting for Lord Castellan's approval. We are fighting to prove, to ourselves as much as anyone watching, exactly what this house is capable of building together. The weeks leading up to the demonstration match brought House Hyoudu's newest members through an accelerated version of exactly the kind of trust-building exercises that had once, slowly and painfully, rebuilt Rias's peerage after the rail yard mission's fracture, though this time Issei found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, occupying the mentor's role rather than the student's. You're overcompensating, he told Kaido, midway through a sparring session that had left the younger devil frustrated and increasingly reckless. You keep trying to prove you belong here by doing too much on your own. That's not what earns trust. Trust comes from showing people they can rely on you to do your actual job well, not from trying to be the hero every single exchange. Kaido, breathing hard, looked at him with something between frustration and genuine reflection. That's rich, coming from the security, he said, though there was no real bite in it. Yeah, well, I learned that lesson the hard way, Issei said, a rueful smile crossing his face. Trust me, I know exactly what overcompensating looks like from the inside. I spent months doing exactly what you're doing right now, before someone finally sat me down and explained why it wasn't actually working. Ravel, observing the training session from the shed's entrance, added her own quiet correction once Kaido had caught his breath. There is also a difference, she said, between wanting to prove yourself worthy of a place, and believing you must constantly re-earn that place through exhausting yourself. The first is healthy ambition. The second is simply old fear wearing a more acceptable costume. I would ask you to examine, honestly, which one is actually driving you right now. Kaito considered this seriously, some of his earlier frustration visibly settling into something more thoughtful. The second one, probably, he admitted. I keep waiting for someone to tell me I don't actually belong here yet. No one is going to tell you that, Ravel said gently, because it is not true. You belong here already, Kaito. Not once you have proven something further. Now. Today. The proving, when it happens, is simply confirmation of something that is already settled, not a condition for it. The sisters, Sakura and Suzu, proved quicker studies in coordinated formation work than Issei had initially anticipated. Their unusual dual magic, once properly integrated into House Hyoudu's developing tactical approach, providing a flexible, adaptive core that Ravel, watching their training with evident professional satisfaction, declared genuinely promising. They compensate for each other's blind spots almost instinctively, she observed, during one particularly impressive coordinated exercise. That kind of natural synergy cannot be taught, only refined. We are fortunate to have found them, Ravel herself, settling into her new role as queen with evident, growing confidence, brought a considerably expanded magical repertoire to her own combat contributions. The queen pieces combined strengths allowing her to weave offense and defense together in ways her earlier bishop status had never permitted. I confess I underestimated how different this would feel, she admitted to Issei one evening, testing the new combination of raw power and refined control with evident fascination. It is not simply more strength. It is an entirely different rhythm to how I move through a fight. I find I rather enjoy the adjustment. By the time the demonstration match's scheduled date finally arrived, House Hyoudou, 5 devils strong and barely 2 months into its formal existence, had forged, through genuine effort and hard-won mutual trust, something considerably more cohesive than its brief formation history might have suggested to any skeptical outside observer. Lord Castellan's peerage, waiting at the arena when House Hyoudou finally arrived for the demonstration match, carried the particular polished confidence of a house with generations of established tradition behind it, each member moving with the practiced, disciplined bearing of devils who had never once needed to question their own belonging. I confess I did not expect quite this level of turnout for what was intended as a simple demonstration, Lord Castellan observed, surveying the considerable crowd that had gathered, drawn by the same underworld gossip networks that had once made Issei and Ravel's own wedding controversy such thorough public spectacle. It seems your house's formation has generated rather more interest than I anticipated. People are curious whether your accusations hold up under actual scrutiny, Ravel said evenly, entirely unbothered by his obvious attempt at intimidation. I imagine we shall find out shortly. The match began with Lord Castellan's peerage pressing an immediate, confident advantage, their generations of coordinated tradition evident in every practiced exchange, and for the opening minutes, House Hyoudou found itself genuinely tested, the gap between an established house's polished coordination and a 2-month-old peerage's still developing cohesion clearly, uncomfortably visible. Hold formation, Ravel's voice cut clear and steady through the coordination line, refusing to let the early pressure fracture the team's composure. This is exactly the kind of test we prepared for. Trust what we built. Kaito, pressed hard by an experienced opposing rook, found himself nearly overwhelmed in the match's early exchanges, old instinct urging him toward exactly the kind of reckless overcompensation Issei had warned him against. But he caught himself at the critical moment, falling back instead to the coordinated support position Ravel had drilled into the team's formation. And the sisters' dual magic closed the gap his retreat created with a fluid, practiced precision that surprised even Lord Castellan's confident peerage. They're actually coordinating, one of the opposing knights muttered, audible enough for Issei to hear even through the chaos of the ongoing exchange, genuine surprise coloring the words. This isn't what the reports suggested. The match's momentum shifted gradually but unmistakably as House Hyoudu's early uncertainty gave way to increasingly confident execution, each member finding their footing within the formation Ravel had so carefully designed, and Issei, anchoring the center exactly as he had once anchored Rias's own peerage through its hardest-fought battles, felt something settle deep and satisfying in his chest, watching this new, still young house finally begin to genuinely function as the coordinated whole it had been carefully, deliberately built to become. The decisive exchange came when Ravel, reading the battlefield with the same tactical brilliance that had once turned the tide against House Vashti itself, identified an opening in Lord Castellan's own defensive positioning, and House Hyoudou converged on it with a coordinated precision that ended the match decisively. Lord Castellan's peerage forced into formal concession considerably sooner than their earlier confident bearing had suggested they expected. The crowd's reaction shifted, visibly and audibly, from skeptical curiosity to genuine, surprised respect, and Lord Castellan himself, approaching the arena's center to offer his required concession, wore an expression considerably more subdued than his earlier condescension had promised. "I confess my assumptions about your house's legitimacy were, perhaps, premature," he said, stiff but sincere in his own aristocratic fashion. "You have my genuine acknowledgement." House Hyoudu's recognition appears, on this evidence, thoroughly earned. "Thank you," Issei said, extending a hand that Lord Castellan, after only the briefest hesitation, accepted. "That means something, coming from someone who actually watched us prove it rather than just taking our word for it." The celebration that followed, considerably more modest than the grand championship reception that had once marked Rias's tournament victory, carried its own particular, hard-won warmth. 5 devils and the small circle of friends and family who had gathered to support them gathering in House Hyoudu's still sparsely furnished office space for an impromptu, genuinely joyful gathering. "We did it," Kaito said, still faintly disbelieving, nursing a celebratory drink with the particular giddy relief of someone who had genuinely doubted, right up until the match's decisive final exchange, whether the young house could actually pull off the victory. "We actually did it." "Of course we did," Sakura said, though her own evident relief undercut the confident delivery. Ravel's formation planning was flawless. The formation planning only works if everyone executing it trusts each other enough to follow through under real pressure, Ravel corrected, though there was clear pride in her voice as she said it. "That part, all of you built yourselves this past 2 months. I am, genuinely, considerably proud of what we have accomplished together in such a short time." Rias, present among the small gathered crowd despite the considerable demands of her own peerage's continuing obligations, raised her own glass toward the newly validated house with evident, unguarded warmth. "To House Hyoudou," she said. "Watching you build this from nothing, in barely 2 months, into something capable of decisively defeating an established house's demonstration challenge, that is exactly the kind of accomplishment I always believed you were capable of, Issei. Even in our hardest early days together. I couldn't have done any of this without everything you and the rest of the old peerage taught me," Issei said, genuine gratitude evident in his voice. "This house exists because of lessons I learned the hard way, in your clubroom, with all of you. I don't think I'll ever stop being grateful for that, even now that we're technically separate houses." "We are not so separate as all that," Rias said, something warm and certain in her expression. "Family, in my experience, rarely respects formal peerage boundaries quite as strictly as underworld politics might prefer. I fully intend to remain very much a part of your life, and this house's continued success, regardless of whose formal banner you now fight under." Ravel, finding Issei's hand amid the warm, celebratory noise of the gathering, squeezed it once, quiet satisfaction evident in her expression. 2 months, she said, marveling slightly at the accomplishment. "It feels considerably longer, given everything we managed to build in that time. Feels like exactly the right amount of time, actually," Issei said, smiling. "Given everything we learned building it the hard way, the first time around." Lord and Lady Phoenix requested another formal audience within days of the demonstration match's outcome reaching them through the underworld's usual efficient gossip networks, and Ravel, considerably more relaxed about this particular visit than her earlier nervousness about announcing their engagement, seemed almost amused by her mother's evident eagerness to hear every detail firsthand. A queen piece now, and helping lead an entirely independent house, Lady Phoenix said, studying her daughter with an expression that mixed genuine pride with something almost wistful. "I confess, watching you now, I find myself remembering the frightened little girl who used to practice her etiquette lessons until her hands shook, so terrified of disappointing everyone's expectations of her. I am considerably less terrified of disappointing anyone's expectations these days, Mother, Ravel said, though there was warmth rather than sharpness in the observation. I find that particular fear has largely been replaced with simply building whatever I actually believe is worth building. Lord Phoenix, watching the exchange with quiet satisfaction, finally spoke, his deep voice carrying its usual unhurried weight. House Hyoudou, he said, turning the name over consideringly. A young house, barely formed, already demonstrating the kind of coordinated strength most established houses take generations to properly cultivate. I find myself, increasingly, glad I did not object more strenuously to this match when I had the opportunity, all those months ago. You were never truly opposed, Ravel pointed out, amusement clear in her voice. You simply enjoyed watching Issei prove himself under pressure. A father is entitled to his small pleasures, Lord Phoenix said, entirely unrepentant, though the warmth in his expression left no doubt of his genuine affection for both his daughter and her chosen husband. Riser, present for the visit despite his usual busy schedule managing House Phoenix's considerable holdings, offered his own characteristically dry but sincere congratulations. An independent house, barely 2 months old, already earning formal recognition from a skeptical established rival, he said, studying Issei with evident, genuine respect. I confess, Hyoudou, you continue to exceed whatever modest expectations I originally held for you. I find I do not mind being wrong nearly so much as I once assumed I would. High praise coming from you, Issei said, grinning. Do not let it go to your head, Riser said, though his own answering smile undercut the mock severity entirely. I remain, after all, considerably more accomplished than you in most measurable respects. But I will grant you this much. Watching you build something genuinely new, from nothing, in barely 2 months, that is not a small accomplishment, however you eventually measure it against my own considerably longer legacy. Issei's own parents, informed of House Hyoudou's formal establishment with considerably less underworld political weight attached to their understanding of the news, responded with the same warm, uncomplicated enthusiasm that had defined their reaction to every major milestone of the past eventful year. Your own house, his mother said, delighted and slightly overwhelmed in equal measure, during a quiet family dinner arranged specifically to properly celebrate the achievement. I don't fully understand what that means, exactly in devil terms, but it sounds wonderful, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you. It basically means I'm in charge of my own team now, Issei explained, doing his best to translate the underworld's complicated political structure into terms that made sense outside it. Kind of like starting my own company, I guess, if that helps. Oh, like a business, his father said, nodding with evident, if somewhat approximate, understanding. Well, congratulations, son. Your grandfather would have been proud too, I think. He always said you had more drive than you let people see. The comparison, unexpected and quietly touching, settled warm in Issei's chest for the remainder of the evening, and Ravel, watching the easy, uncomplicated warmth of his family's celebration, found herself, not for the first time, quietly grateful for the particular grounding presence Issei's human family provided amid the considerably more complicated political weight of underworld society. They love you very simply, she observed later, the two of them walking home together through the familiar streets of Kuo. No complicated political calculation, no assessment of what your accomplishments mean for anyone's broader standing. Simply pride uncomplicated by anything beyond genuine affection. Yeah, Issei agreed. It's kind of grounding, honestly. Keeps me from getting too caught up in all the underworld politics stuff. I find I rather value that about them too, Ravel admitted. It is, I think, part of why I have grown so fond of your family, beyond simply their connection to you. They remind me that worth does not always need to be measured in the terms I grew up believing were the only ones that mattered. The formal rating game ranking system, Issei learned in the weeks following House Hyoudu's successful demonstration match, required newly established houses to compete through an official qualifying bracket before receiving genuine, sanctioned standing within the broader tournament circuit, a considerably more involved process than the single demonstration match Lord Castellan had informally arranged. 3 qualifying matches, Ravel explained, reviewing the formal documentation with her usual meticulous attention. Against houses of comparable newly established standing, followed by a final match against a mid-tier established house, should we successfully advance through the preliminary rounds. It is designed to test genuine capability across a range of opponents, rather than allowing a single strong showing to secure standing that might not hold up under sustained scrutiny. Sounds like a lot, Kaido said, though there was more excitement than trepidation in his voice now. The demonstration match's hard-won success having settled considerably more confidence into the young rook than his earlier nervousness might have suggested possible. The first qualifying match, against a similarly young house built around a reincarnated devil with considerable raw physical power but comparatively little tactical sophistication, proved a relatively straightforward victory for House Hyoudou. Ravel's careful formation planning and the team's steadily deepening coordination overwhelming their opponent's more straightforward, less refined approach within the match's opening third. The second qualifying match brought a more genuine test, an opposing house built around a talented young strategist whose careful, methodical approach mirrored some of Ravel's own tactical instincts, and the resulting contest stretched considerably longer than House Hyoudu's first outing, both sides probing carefully for advantage across a series of tense, closely fought exchanges. "They're mirroring our formation shifts," Ravel observed partway through the match, studying the opposing strategist's adjustments with evident professional respect. "Whoever is coordinating their side has clearly studied our demonstration match closely." "So what do we do?" Issei asked, boosted gear humming steady against his arm as they waited for an opening. "We stop repeating patterns they have already studied," Ravel said, already adjusting the team's positioning with quick, decisive precision. "Sakura, Suzu, invert your usual formation. Kaido, hold center instead of flank for this exchange. Issei, follow my lead rather than your usual instinct." The sudden, unexpected reshuffling caught their opponents genuinely off guard, exactly as Ravel had intended, and House Hyoudou secured a hard-fought but ultimately decisive victory. The team's willingness to abandon even their own established patterns when circumstances demanded proving, once again, the particular value of the flexible, trust-based approach Ravel had spent months carefully cultivating. The third qualifying match, against a house whose primary strength lay in coordinated illusion and misdirection tactics, tested House Hyoudu's cohesion in ways that echoed, uncomfortably, some of Issei's own earlier experience during the Gremory peerage's own tournament run against similar tactics, and it was Kaido, drawing on lessons Issei had personally taught him about trusting bond over simple sight, who ultimately identified the critical opening that secured their advancement. "I heard your voice through the illusions," Kaido told Ravel afterward, still faintly amazed at his own accomplishment. "Just like you always told me to. I didn't even have to think about it. It just worked." "That is precisely the point," Ravel said, unable to keep the proud smile from her expression. "Trust, properly built, does not require conscious effort to access when it matters most. It simply becomes part of how you move through the world." Kaido, still catching his breath from the match's tense final exchange, allowed himself a small, satisfied grin. "I think I finally get what you two kept trying to explain to me, back when I first joined," he said. "It's not really about the tactics at all, is it? It's about actually trusting the people standing next to you enough to stop thinking so hard about it." "Now you understand," Ravel said, warmth evident in her voice. "That is, I believe, the single most important lesson this house was ever meant to teach." The final qualifying match, against an established mid-tier house with several decades of tournament experience behind it, arrived with considerably higher stakes than any of House Hyoudu's preceding contests, formal sanction standing within the broader rating games circuit hanging directly on the outcome. Lord Ashworth, whose house had built its reputation on decades of consistent, disciplined tournament performance, studied House Hyoudu's assembled team with the particular careful assessment of someone who had watched their preliminary matches closely and arrived considerably better prepared than Lord Castellan's earlier condescending dismissal had suggested his own house's leadership might be. "Your house has performed admirably for its age," he acknowledged, before the match's formal beginning, genuine respect rather than condescension coloring the observation. "I do not intend to make the same mistake certain of my colleagues made, underestimating you based on your house's youth alone. My peerage has prepared thoroughly for this contest." "We wouldn't have expected anything less," Ravel said, matching his respectful tone with her own. "We look forward to a genuinely challenging match." The contest that followed proved, exactly as promised, the most demanding test House Hyoudou had yet faced, Lord Ashworth's experienced peerage pressing every advantage their decades of accumulated tournament wisdom provided, forcing House Hyoudou's still developing coordination to its genuine limits across a grueling, closely contested battle. It was in the match's final, decisive exchange, House Hyoudou's formation stretched thin but holding through sheer accumulated trust and hard-won coordination, that Issei, balance breaker roaring at full output with Ravel's steady voice guiding every movement exactly as it always had, finally broke through Lord Ashworth's experienced defenses. The combined weight of everything House Hyoudou had built together across its brief but intensive formation finally proving sufficient to overcome decades of established tradition. Well fought, Lord Ashworth said afterward, genuine admiration evident in his voice despite the defeat. I confess I did not expect a house barely 3 months formed to press my own peerage this thoroughly. You have my sincere respect, and my formal endorsement for House Hyoudou's continued advancement within official tournament circles. The formal ranking confirmation arrived within days. House Hyoudou's name entered officially into the Underworld's sanctioned rating game registry, a small but unmistakably significant milestone in the young house's continued growth, and the celebration that followed, though modest compared to the grand spectacle of Rias's own championship reception months earlier, carried its own particular, hard-won satisfaction. We're official, Kaido said, still faintly disbelieving, studying the formal registry confirmation with evident wonder. Actually, properly official. We were always going to be, Ravel said, though her own evident satisfaction undercut the confident delivery slightly. This simply confirms, formally, what all of us have known for some time now. That we built something genuinely capable together, in a remarkably short span of time. Winter settled slowly over Ko in the weeks following House Hyoudou's official ranking confirmation, and the young house's daily rhythms gradually shifted from the intense, formation-defining pressure of its first months towards something more sustainable, the same kind of hard-won ordinary stability that had eventually settled over Rias's own peerage following its own difficult early trials. Issei found himself, increasingly, occupying a role he had never fully anticipated when boosted gear first manifested on his arm years earlier, not simply a fighter proving his own worth, but a genuine mentor, responsible now for the growth and well-being of devils who had chosen, deliberately and with real trust, to build their futures alongside his own. You've gotten better at this than I expected, Ravel observed one evening, watching him patiently work through a tactical debrief with Kaido and the Ichino's sisters, correcting small errors with the same careful, constructive honesty she had once brought exclusively to his own training. Teaching, I mean. It suits you rather more naturally than I might have predicted, given how recently you were the one needing exactly this kind of patient correction yourself. I had a good teacher, Issei said, glancing toward her with obvious warmth. Turns out a lot of what you taught me stuck. Evidently, Ravel said, something quietly proud in her expression. I confess I did not fully anticipate, that first evening on the shrine steps, exactly how far the lessons I offered you would eventually travel. Watching you now, guiding your own devils through exactly the kind of growth I once guided you through, that is a particular kind of satisfaction I did not know to expect. The house's continued growth brought its own small, ordinary challenges, Kaido's occasional overconfidence requiring periodic gentle correction, the Ichino's sisters still developing trust in devils outside their own tight sibling bond gradually expanding to encompass the broader house, Gasper's steady, quiet growth continuing at its own careful pace under Ravel's patient, understanding guidance. It was, Issei thought, watching his small but genuinely cohesive house settle into its own particular rhythms, exactly the kind of family he had once feared. In his darkest isolated weeks following the rail yard mission, he might never find the chance to build again, transformed now into something he had built deliberately, with open eyes and hard-won wisdom, from the very foundation up. A minor crisis arrived unexpectedly in early winter, considerably smaller in scale than the Ouroboros conflict that had once tested Issei's original peerage so thoroughly, but genuinely significant nonetheless. A cluster of rogue devils, remnants of some scattered lesser faction with no clear connection to any of House Hyoudou's prior conflicts, having taken up residence in an abandoned section of Koa's industrial district. Local territorial dispute, Azazel explained, briefing House Hyoudou directly for the first time since its formal establishment, something like genuine respect evident in his usual dry delivery. Nothing connected to Ouroboros or House Vashti's old network, as far as my sources can determine. Simply a group of displaced devils causing enough disruption that Koa's territorial authority wants it addressed properly. Given your house's new standing, I thought you might appreciate handling this one independently, rather than deferring to Rias's peerage the way you might have a year ago. We can handle it, Issei said, and found, saying it, that he genuinely believed it, House Hyoudou's hard-won cohesion from the preceding months settling into confident, steady certainty rather than the anxious uncertainty that might once have accompanied such a claim. The operation itself, when House Hyoudou finally moved against the rogue devil's makeshift stronghold, proceeded with a clean, coordinated efficiency that reflected everything the young house had built together across its brief but intensive formation period, Kaido and the Ichino's sisters handling the perimeter with confident, practiced precision, while Issei and Ravel, anchoring the operations center exactly as they always did, drove directly toward the heart of the disturbance. This feels different, Kaido observed afterward, once the rogue devils had been subdued and handed over to proper territorial authority for processing, genuine satisfaction evident in his voice. Not just winning. Winning as something that's actually ours. Something we built. That is, I think, precisely the point, Ravel said, warm satisfaction evident in her own expression. This house was never meant to simply replicate what already existed elsewhere. It was meant to become something genuinely, deliberately its own. Gasper, quiet as ever but steadier now than he had been in all the months Issei had known him, offered his own small, thoughtful addition to the conversation. I like that it's ours, he said simply. I like being part of something we're still figuring out together, instead of just fitting into something that already had all its answers before I arrived. Issei, listening to his small, hard-won house reflect on their first genuine independent operation together, felt something settle warm and certain in his chest, the particular satisfaction of watching something built deliberately, carefully, out of genuine trust rather than simple obligation, finally begin to fully find its own footing in the world. The first genuine snow of the season arrived on an otherwise ordinary evening, and Issei found himself, watching it drift slowly past the windows of House Hyoudou's small office space, thinking back over the entire remarkable span of the past year and a half, from a frightened, isolated boy sitting alone on cold stone steps to the leader of his own genuinely cohesive, hard-won house. Ravel found him there, quiet and reflective amid the gathering snow, and settled beside him without needing to ask what occupied his thoughts, the easy, wordless understanding between them grown deep enough now that such questions rarely required actual asking. I keep thinking about how far we've come, Issei admitted, watching the snow continue its slow, steady accumulation outside. From that first night, to a wedding, to Ouroboros, to a championship, to this. Our own house. Our own people, trusting us enough to build their futures around what we're doing here. He shook his head slightly, still faintly amazed by the accumulated weight of it all. I don't think I ever really let myself imagine getting here, back when I was sitting on those shrine steps feeling like I'd lost everything that mattered. Nor did I, if I am entirely honest, Ravel said, leaning into him, watching the same gentle snowfall. I remember thinking, that first evening, simply that I recognized something familiar in your loneliness, something I understood from my own experience. I did not imagine, watching a frightened, isolated boy on those steps, that I was witnessing the beginning of everything that eventually followed. She smiled, soft and genuine. Life has a curious way of exceeding whatever modest expectations we initially hold for it, provided we remain willing to actually build towards something better rather than simply accepting whatever difficult circumstance first presents itself. Is that a fortune cookie, or an actual thought? Issei asked, laughing softly. Both, perhaps, Ravel said, laughing along with him, the easy warmth between them settling comfortable and familiar into the quiet, snow-filled evening. I find I have grown rather fond of offering you unsolicited wisdom, over the course of our acquaintance. Old habits, I suppose? I wouldn't have it any other way, Issei said, pulling her close as the snow continued its slow, gentle descent outside their window. Any of it. Not the hard parts, not the easy ones. All of it got us here. They sat together a while longer, watching the season's first snow settle soft and quiet over the familiar streets of Ko, the small house they had built together from genuine trust and hard-won lessons continuing its steady, ordinary work somewhere beyond their quiet window, and Issei, holding Ravel close in the gathering winter evening, found himself grateful, more deeply than he had adequate words to properly express, for every difficult step of the long, remarkable journey that had fully carried them here. Rias visited House Hyoudu's small office the following week, ostensibly on formal territorial business but clearly, from the moment she arrived, carrying rather more sentimental purpose than the official pretext suggested. I wanted to see it properly, she admitted, once the formal business had concluded, studying the modest but carefully organized space with evident interest. Your own house, fully operational now. I confess I have been curious, watching from a respectful distance these past few months, exactly what you and Ravel were building here. Issei gave her the full tour, introducing her properly to Kaido and the Ichino's sisters, both of whom greeted the legendary Rias Gremory with a mixture of genuine awe and careful professional composure that reminded Issei, fondly, of his own early nervousness meeting figures of similar underworld standing. They speak of you very highly, Rias observed afterward, once the introductions had concluded and the newer members of House Hyoudou had returned to their own training. Kaido mentioned, rather earnestly, that you remind him what genuine leadership looks like. That's not a small thing to hear, Issei, from someone who chose to build their entire future around trusting your judgment. I learned from the best, Issei said, meaning it entirely. Everything I know about actually leading well, I learned watching you rebuild trust with all of us after the rail yard. I'm just trying to pass along what I picked up. Rias's expression softened, something reflective and genuinely moved crossing her features. I do not think I ever properly thanked you, she said, for giving me the chance to rebuild that trust, rather than simply walking away entirely, that first difficult year. I know how close it came, some nights, to being unrecoverable. You earned it back, Issei said simply. That's what actually mattered. Not that it almost broke. That you did the work to fix it properly, once you understood how badly it had actually broken. Ravel, joining the conversation as she finished a final review of the day's training reports, added her own quiet observation. It is, I think, the same lesson this entire house has been built around, she said. Trust is never simply given once and permanently secured. It requires continuous, deliberate maintenance, the willingness to keep choosing each other, actively, even after the initial difficulty that first tested it has long since passed. She glanced toward Issei with evident warmth. We try to build that understanding into everything House Hyoudou does, from the very foundation up. Rias studied them both for a long, quiet moment, something deeply satisfied settling into her expression. You've built something remarkable here, she said finally. Both of you. I could not be prouder, watching everything that's grown from that one difficult night, all this time ago. Before she left, Rias lingered a moment longer at the office door, something more personal surfacing behind her usual composed diplomacy. There is one more thing, she said. Sona and I have been discussing a joint training exchange, periodically, between our peerages and your house. Nothing formal or binding. Simply an opportunity for your newer devils to train alongside people with more established experience, and for my own peerage to keep learning from whatever new approaches you continue developing. She smiled, warm and genuine. I would like House Hyoudou to remain close to the family that helped build it, even now that you stand independently. I hope that does not read as unwelcome interference. It reads as exactly the kind of thing I'd have hoped you'd suggest, Issei said, and meant it entirely. We'd be glad to have that. Both directions. Ravel nodded her own agreement, something warm crossing her expression. It would mean a great deal to all of us here, she said. Particularly to Kaido, I suspect. I do not believe he has fully recovered from meeting you in person today. I anticipate he will mention it at every opportunity for at least the next several weeks. Rias laughed, genuine and unguarded. Then I shall look forward to becoming thoroughly tired of hearing about it, she said, which strikes me as a considerably better problem to have than the alternative. The visit concluded with warm, easy farewells, Rias promising to arrange the first joint training session within the coming weeks, and once she had departed, Issei found himself reflecting, with quiet satisfaction, on exactly how naturally the two houses, though formally independent now, continued to function as extensions of the same larger, hard-won family. "It's strange," he said to Ravel, once the office had settled back into its usual quiet evening rhythm. "A year ago I would have thought becoming independent meant losing all that. Turns out it just means the family got a little bigger instead. That has been, I think, the pattern of this entire remarkable journey," Ravel observed, settling beside him as the evening light continued its slow fade toward dusk outside their window. "Every difficult ending we have weathered together has, eventually, opened into something larger and more generous than what came before it. I confess I have grown rather fond of that particular pattern." "Yeah," Issei said, smiling as he watched the last of the day's light settle golden across the small, hard-won office that had become, in barely 3 months, genuinely and unmistakably theirs. "Me too." The year drew toward its close with House Hyoudou fully settled into its own particular, hard-won rhythms, and Issei found himself, on the last quiet evening before the calendar turned, standing once more on the familiar shrine steps where everything between himself and Ravel had first genuinely begun, the same worn stone beneath him. Though considerably more had changed around it than either of them could have easily predicted that first frightened, lonely evening, Ravel joined him there, as she so often still did, settling beside him with the same easy, comfortable familiarity that had defined their relationship from its very earliest days. "An entire year and a half," she said, marveling slightly at the accumulated span of it. "From a single difficult evening on these steps, to everything that followed. I find myself, reflecting on it now, entirely unable to imagine the version of my life that might have unfolded had I simply walked past you that first night, occupied with my own concerns as anyone reasonably might have been." "I think about that sometimes too," Issei admitted. "But I try not to spend too much time on it. Feels like it might jinx something, dwelling too much on the version of things that didn't happen." "A curiously superstitious sentiment, for a devil," Ravel said, though there was fondness rather than genuine criticism in the observation. "Yeah, well, I've earned the right to be a little superstitious, I think, given everything that's actually happened to us." Issei glanced toward her, something warm and settled in his expression. "I'd rather just be grateful for the version that did happen. That feels like a better use of the time." Ravel considered this for a moment before nodding, something soft and genuinely content settling into her own expression. "That is, I think, a wiser approach than my own tendency toward reflective what-if scenarios," she admitted. "Very well. Grateful, then, rather than dwelling on unrealized alternatives." She leaned into him, watching the quiet, ordinary evening settle comfortably over the familiar streets of Ko below. "I am grateful, Issei. For all of it. The difficult parts as much as the easy ones, exactly as you once told me, that snowy evening not so long ago." "Yeah," Issei said, pulling her close as the last light of the year's final evening faded slowly into the gathering dark. "Me too. All of it." Somewhere below them, the ordinary lights of Ko continued their steady, comfortable glow, House Hyoudu's small office window visible among them, warm and lit against the deepening winter night, a young house built deliberately from hard-won trust, standing steady now among the town's familiar, established rhythms, and Issei, holding Ravel close on the same worn stone steps where their entire remarkable journey had first genuinely begun, found himself looking forward, without hesitation or old fear, to whatever the next chapter of their shared, hard-won life together might yet bring. Kaito found them there, some time later, having tracked them down with the particular earnest determination of a young devil still getting used to the informal rhythms of his new house, a folder of preliminary training notes for the coming spring season clutched under one arm. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, a little breathless from the walk up the shrine's stone path. "I wanted to show you the schedule I put together for the joint training sessions, before I forget in the morning rush. I might have gotten a little excited planning it." Ravel took the folder with evident amusement, flipping through pages of carefully, if somewhat overenthusiastically, organized scheduling. "This is remarkably thorough," she said, genuine approval in her voice. "You have clearly been paying close attention to how these things are properly structured." "I learned from watching you," Kaito said, something proud and a little shy in his expression. I figured if I'm going to help run logistics for this house someday, I should actually learn how to do it properly, instead of just winging it. Issei studied the young rook for a long moment, remembering, with quiet fondness, his own early eagerness to prove himself worthy of Rias's trust, all those months ago. You're going to do great things here, Kaido, he said. I mean that. Not just in fights. In everything you're building toward. Kaido flushed, pleased and a little overwhelmed by the direct praise, and mumbled something appreciative before excusing himself back down the shrine steps, leaving Issei and Ravel alone once more in the gathering evening quiet. He reminds me so much of you, Ravel said, watching him go, fondness evident in her voice. That same eager hunger to matter to somebody, to prove himself worthy of the trust extended to him. Yeah, Issei said, smiling as he watched the last of Kaido's retreating figure disappear down the path. I see it too. Hope we're doing right by him. By all of them. We are, Ravel said, with the same absolute certainty she brought to everything that truly mattered to her. I have no doubt of that whatsoever. I watch how carefully you consider each of their needs, how patiently you correct their mistakes without ever making them feel small for making them in the first place. That is not something every leader manages, Issei, however naturally it may come to you now. I have watched considerably more experienced devils fail at exactly that particular balance. I had a lot of practice being on the receiving end of it done badly, Issei said, something quieter in his voice now. Makes it easier to remember what not to do, perhaps, Ravel allowed. Though I think it is rather more than simply avoiding old mistakes. I think you have built something here out of genuine care, not merely careful avoidance. There is a difference, and I believe everyone in this house feels it, whether or not they could properly articulate it themselves. They lingered a while longer on the quiet shrine steps, the winter evening settling fully into night around them, and eventually, as the first stars began to emerge overhead, rose together to make their own way back down toward the warm, waiting lights of the small house they had built, deliberately and with hard-won wisdom, out of everything difficult and everything good that an entire remarkable, eventful year and a half had asked of them both.